I scanned my badge at 8:59 and 47 seconds. The machine gave a tiny beep, a sound so trivial that most people would never even notice it. But for me, that faint chirp felt like the opening note of a symphony I had been composing for more than a decade. It was the signal that everything I had prepared was finally in motion. The lobby of Novacor Systems was a glass cathedral. High ceilings stretched above polished marble floors that reflected every movement like water. The air smelled faintly of citrus from the industrial diffusers hidden behind the sleek pillars, a scent that was supposed to energize employees while they dragged themselves into work. Usually, I walked through that lobby without even noticing the details. But today, every sound, every glint of light, every breath felt sharp, alive, deliberate, because I knew what was about to happen. "Ms. Rhodes!" Her voice snapped across the lobby like the click of a metronome. A young woman in a black blazer, barely older than the interns I used to train, stepped forward with a tablet pressed against her chest. The name tag pinned to her lapel read Human Resources Associate, Junior Level. She looked like someone who still rehearsed her lines in front of the bathroom mirror before work, but her expression was composed, professional, practiced for this moment. "You clocked in late, 1 minute past company policy." I glanced at the turnstile screen. 8:59:47. My fingerprint and ID number glowed in the digital log, precise down to the second. 1 minute, I repeated softly, letting the words linger on my tongue. "Yes," she replied with a flicker of satisfaction. "As per the zero-tolerance timekeeping initiative, 1 hour's pay will be docked." There it was, the weapon they thought would cut me down. I should have argued, should have laughed, maybe, or at least raised my voice the way most people would. 1 minute late, after 17 years of loyalty, after nights spent in freezing server rooms, after dozens of crises averted by my hand alone. But instead, I simply smiled. Because this was the moment I had been waiting for. I pressed the elevator button and stepped inside, ignoring the curious glances of a few interns lingering nearby. The polished steel doors slid shut, and in the mirrored reflection I saw myself. Dark blazer, white blouse, hair pulled back into a tight knot, a face lined not by makeup but by years of midnight alarms and war rooms lit by the glow of failing dashboards. People had called me relentless, obsessive, uncompromising. They weren't wrong. That was how you survived in a place like this. The elevator hummed as it climbed. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't need to look at it. I already knew what the notification said. Material reduction in compensation detected. That was the legal phrasing. The signal that triggered the chain reaction I had designed. By the time the elevator reached the 27th floor, my plan would already be unfolding in the background, as precise as a clockwork mechanism. The doors opened. The 27th floor smelled different from the lobby, less polished, more chemical, like glass cleaner sprayed too often. Rows of identical desks lined the open office, each occupied by a young, eager face staring into monitors filled with colorful dashboards. Graphs, metrics, numbers ticking upward or downward in real time. But I knew the truth. Most of them didn't understand what those numbers meant. They were passengers watching gauges, not drivers holding the wheel. And at the far end of the corridor, framed by glass walls and a skyline view of the city, sat Sloane Carter. Sloane was 34, polished to perfection, the kind of person who carried herself as if the world were a mirror reflecting her success. She had joined 6 months ago, armed with a glittering MBA and a smile that seemed rehearsed in front of boardroom mirrors. She spoke of cultural refresh and cost alignment. Within weeks, the small jungle of office plants had vanished, the beloved espresso machine had been replaced with a cheaper drip system, and the halls were filled with the brittle silence of engineers who no longer trusted leadership. Now, she was the queen of optimization, and I was her next target. I turned toward my corner office. The mug on my desk caught my eye before anything else. Cracked ceramic, faded letters, world's okayest firefighter of incidents. My team had given it to me years ago, after I saved the company 17 times in 1 quarter from system meltdowns. It had been tossed into the recycling bin yesterday by order of HR. Sloane said it was clutter. I knew it was a message. The mug was gone, but its meaning was. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. My fingers moved automatically, entering 3 separate passwords, navigating through folders layered like Russian dolls. Tax files, personal photos, vacation itineraries, decoys for anyone curious enough to snoop. And buried deeper in a folder-marked umbrella was the heart of everything. Contracts, addendums, annotated clauses highlighted in yellow, 17 years of evidence meticulously logged, and in the center of it all, a single PDF, my original employment agreement. Clause 14C subsection 9. The words had been written 12 years ago, back when Novacor was still a scrappy startup clawing its way into the world of global finance. The founders hadn't understood the language. They barely read it. But I had insisted, and they had agreed. Any unilateral reduction in compensation, including but not limited to docking of pay, shall constitute grounds for immediate good reason termination and trigger acceleration of all unvested equity at current fair market value. Most people would have skimmed it. Most people did, but I hadn't. I'd stared at those words like a general studying a map, memorizing every inch, every possibility. My lawyer had called it paranoia. I had called it foresight. And today that foresight was worth nearly $100 million. My phone buzzed again. This time I answered. "You saw the timestamp?" Kyle's voice crackled through the line. He was one of the few architects left, one of the old guard who hadn't yet been optimized out. "Yes," I said. "Then it's done?" "It started," I corrected. "By 9:02 they'll know." He exhaled sharply. "Storm's coming." I leaned back in my chair, eyes drifting toward the glass walls of Sloane's office. She looked up from her tablet and locked eyes with me across the open floor. Her smile was the same as always, cold, victorious, the smile of someone who thought they had already won. I smiled back, because she had no idea that she'd just lit the fuse of the biggest explosion this company would ever face. At 9:02 my phone vibrated, then hummed again and again until it felt like a small animal in my pocket. I did not have to look to know what the messages said. The protocol had seen the payroll doc, marked it as a material reduction, and set the sequence in motion. Notices to legal. Notices to the board. Notices to the exchange compliance inbox, and to the outside counsel that Novacor kept on retainer for moments when everything suddenly cost more. I stood, closed the umbrella folder, and walked out into the corridor. The open office floor had a sound that only people who work in operations notice. When systems are healthy, there is a gentle murmur. When something is wrong, the air picks up a new tone. Fingers strike keys a little faster. Chairs roll back with a skittering scrape. Conversations turn into half-whispers as if the building itself might be listening. That tone was already rising. Sloane stepped out of her glass office with the poise of a person who had prepared a speech for today. She was flanked by 2 HR associates with identical tablets. Her smile did not reach her eyes. "Melia," she said, as if we were old friends sharing a joke, "I want to remind you that punctuality is a leadership behavior. We hold our senior people to a higher bar." I nodded. "You docked an hour for 60 seconds, I said. "That is a bar." "Policy is policy," she replied. "Must apply to everyone equally." I let the sentence sit for a second and then said the line I had practiced 100 times. "Then I imagine you will not mind when equal policy applies to you." Her eyes narrowed the slightest bit. She did not know yet, not fully. She only knew something was coming because I did not look afraid. My phone lit again. A preview banner showed the subject line from outside counsel. "Notice of good reason termination received. Equity acceleration inquiry in progress." My stomach did not flutter. The feeling was not adrenaline. It was relief. The parachute had opened exactly when it should. A ping from the overhead speaker announced the daily stand-up for the platform team. The new product manager waved a backpack strap over his shoulder and hurried past with a dozen junior engineers flowing behind him like a school of fish. He was young and eager and perfectly pleasant, and he should never have been placed in charge of things he did not understand. That was not his fault. That was strategy. I walked in the opposite direction toward the executive elevator. I did not hurry. If there is one rule that has always kept me safe, it is this. Move as if you already belong where you are going. The elevator doors parted to reveal mirrors and quiet. Floor numbers climbed with a soft tick. On 29 the doors opened and the chief financial officer entered. Varina Greer. Practical Bob, eyes that counted everything. She nodded once when she saw me, that quick professional gesture that says I know who you are and I am already thinking 4 moves ahead. "Morning, Melia," she said. "Morning, Varina." Her phone vibrated and she glanced down. I saw the color shift in her face by a single shade. She did not speak again. The doors opened on 32. The executive floor was quieter than the rest of the building. Bamboo floors. Art that looked expensive without committing to an opinion. We could have used the budget for a redundant message queue, but the board had decided that minimalism improved focus. Colin was already in his office. Our chief executive liked to sit with the skyline behind him because he thought it made people feel like the city itself was a witness to their choices. He had been an engineer once, and sometimes a sentence would slip out of him with the old cadence of someone who loved to solve real problems. Mostly, he lived in the country of presentations now. He stood when I entered, not out of respect, but because the chair seemed to have forgotten how to hold him up. "What did you do?" he asked without preface. His voice was level, which is the surest sign that a person is not calm. I took the seat across from his desk and folded my hands. "Nothing today that I did not tell this company about 12 years ago," I said. "You docked my pay. My contract says that is a trigger for good reason termination with acceleration. Your legal team is very competent. They will explain the rest." He looked down at his laptop. I saw the reflection of a document in his glasses. The words were small but familiar. I had read them enough times to see them even when I closed my eyes. "We cannot pay this," he said softly. "You already did," I said, "or you will." The clock started at 9:02. Sloane stepped in without knocking. She moved as if she owned the carpet. Her smile was a little too bright. "We can reverse the dock," she said quickly. "If payroll reverses the entry, then technically no reduction occurred." Varina had followed her in and was standing by the window, reading her phone. "Reversal after the fact can be interpreted as retaliation," she said. "It depends on timing. It depends on intent." None of those words sounded like safety. Sloane turned to me. "We can find a cooperative solution," she said. "You are valued. If you return to your role with a performance improvement plan to help guide knowledge transfer, we can discuss a cash settlement for goodwill. Something reasonable." Reasonable is the last word people use before they try to take something you earned and sell it back to you. "No," I said. She blinked. "No to which part?" "No to all of it." The air stretched. Outside the glass, clouds dragged slow shadows across tall buildings. Inside, the thin hum of filtration units formed a kind of white noise that could hide small breaths and very quiet panic. A knock came from the doorway. Elaine from legal. She had 2 laptops open and a third balanced on a stack of folders. She nodded to me and then addressed Colin. "We have a problem," she said. "Only one," Varina murmured. Elaine ignored the joke. "The document is binding. The clause was never superseded by later equity plans. The jurisdiction is Delaware. The language is unusually explicit. Good reason termination with immediate acceleration upon any unilateral reduction in compensation. Docking an hour for a single minute qualifies under the company policy as written." She looked at Sloane when she said that last word. "As written." Colin closed his eyes. He did not rub his temples. He had learned in some training that made him look weak. "Is there anything?" he asked. Elaine opened her mouth and then closed it again. "I have to be honest. We can fight. We can send letters. We can hope a judge likes us. But we will likely lose, and we will certainly burn time we do not have." My phone buzzed again. I glanced at the preview. The automation had sent notices to the compliance team at our primary payment processor to ensure there would be no confusion if Novacor attempted to reverse any entries without documentation. The automation had also scheduled a letter to my personal attorney for filing if any step in the sequence was blocked. I had built it with the same persistence that kept our trade flows alive during market storms. When you have run incident bridges at 3 in the morning, you learn to remove decisions from moments of panic. Another vibration. This time it was not legal, it was operational. The payments dashboard pinged a warning. Latency spikes, certificate issues, the sort of early tremors you only recognize if you have held the map long enough to feel where the earth is thin. I stood slowly. "If you are about to ask me to fix something," I said, "I should clarify my status. My access was terminated at 9:01 according to the notice HR sent when they docked my pay. I am no longer an employee. We can restore access," Sloane said at once, "which will be interesting to explain to the labor board when you are trying to prove that the dock was a neutral policy and not a tool to push out older and more expensive people," I said. My tone was even. I had no interest in making a speech. I was simply drawing the lines on the ground. Colin opened his eyes. "How much?" he asked. "For what?" I said. "For you to help us." I pretended to think, though the number had lived in my head since the first minute I wrote the clause. 250,000 for the first 4 hours, I said, then 12,500 per hour after that. Payment in advance. Wire only. No promises beyond those hours. Sloane made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had found oxygen in the room. "That is extortion. That is the market price of someone who knows which of your 300 services cannot be allowed to fail," I said. "Also the market price of someone who knows who to call and which gatekeepers will pick up after hours. Also the market price of a person you tried to replace with a dashboard. Varina was still looking at her phone. Now she looked up. She nodded once. I will need board approval for the acceleration either way, she said to Colin. If we do not wire the funds and this goes public, the risk profile changes for our debt covenants. It will spook the acquisition. If we do wire the funds, it still spooks the acquisition, but at least we own the narrative. Also, our primary payment processor just flagged a certificate mismatch on our side. Colin looked like a man who had been promised a simple game and discovered he had signed up for a winter expedition. Do it, he said. Varina typed. Elaine typed. Sloane did not type. She watched me with that polished smile and tried to find a lever she could pull that did not exist. While they worked, I took out my phone and sent a short message to Kyle. Check Vault for emergency vendor contacts. Folder name is the phrase we used during the migration project when everything was on fire. Password is the first letters of the 3 servers we swore we would never touch again. He replied with a thumbs up and then another message. The new team does not know what they do not know. Tell them to breathe, I wrote. Tell them to stop touching things for 5 minutes. Tell them the root cause is almost never where the red light is blinking. An assistant appeared at the door and announced that the board was on video for an emergency session. We went to the conference room with the long table and the silent air. It had a view that made the city look like a polite model of itself. There were bottles of water lined up with the labels turned away from the camera because someone once wrote a memo about brand neutrality. Faces appeared on the wall screen. Some I recognized from investor calls. Some I had only seen in photographs attached to articles about growth. Varina summarized the facts in a few sentences. Elaine added the legal conclusion. No one interrupted. When people are losing money, they learn to listen. A man in a navy suit on the screen leaned forward. We cannot possibly pay 90+ to a single employee because she was late by 1 minute. You did not pay me for being late, I said, meeting the camera with my eyes. You paid me because you agreed a long time ago that if you ever tried to reduce my compensation in a way that was not neutral, I could walk away with what I had earned. You made that promise because you needed me then. You still need me. You just forgot why. Another voice cut in. What is the operational status? I looked at the small status panel I had kept open on my phone. Certificate chain issues on the edge. The primary payment gateway was already failing handshakes for a subset of clients. The load balancer timers were approaching a renewal window that required manual coordination with 2 vendors. There was a process that ran at 17 minutes past 3 in the morning to reconcile partner settlements. If that process missed its window, the next sunrise would be completed by legal, not engineering. Fragile, I said, not yet broken. 15 minutes to red if no one touches anything and someone who knows the vendor side begins the rotation now. The navy suit looked at Colin. Pay her, he said, then to me, and get it done. Varina typed. Colin nodded. Sloane stared at the table as if a message might appear there if she looked hard enough. My phone buzzed with a wire confirmation. My attorney sent a single word reply. Cleared. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. It was not about the number, though numbers have their own kind of gravity. It was about the principle that time can be a rope or a blade, depending on who holds it. I stood. Send me a fresh authorization that I am acting as a consultant with limited access for the next 4 hours, I said. Copy legal and the vendor relations team. Then stay out of my way. No one objected. Back on 27, the air was a full minute louder. The platform team was gathered around a cluster of screens that were doing their best impression of a holiday display. Red everywhere. Timers, counters, a screaming chorus of alerts that made no distinction between urgent and important. I did not raise my voice. Panic is a virus. Calm is too. Everyone breathe, I said. Keep your hands off production unless I say otherwise. Bring me a list of current certificate expirations and the last time you rotated the route. Bring me the names and numbers for our primary contact at CloudKey and at GlobalPay. If you do not have those numbers, bring me the actual person who knows them. The new product manager nodded quickly and began typing. He had that look of a person who had discovered that leadership is not a posture. It is a weight. Kyle slipped through the cluster with a laptop open. Found the vault entry, he said under his breath. The passwords are in the format we always used. The vendor list has personal cells. Good, I said. You call CloudKey. Ask for Jerome. Tell him it is Malia if they hesitate. Tell him the phrase from the night we fixed their cert issue during his kid birthday party. He will know. I will call GlobalPay. He grinned and vanished into a quiet room to place the call. I stood at a desk, put the phone on speaker, and dialed the number that lived in muscle memory. Global Pay Vendor Relations, a voice answered. Samantha, I said. It is Malia at Novacor. Oh, thank God, she said without ceremony. We have been trying to reach someone who understands your side for 30 minutes. Your mutual TLS is failing at the edge. We are seeing a mismatch. We can whitelist for a short window, but we need confirmation from your authorized contact. I forwarded the email that legal had just sent giving me limited authorization. Check your inbox, I said. I have it, she said. Whitelisting backup endpoints for 8 hours. Please tell whoever redesigned your documentation that burying the vendor contact list behind 5 levels of approvals is a creative way to meet new people at 3 in the morning. Noted, I said. Switching traffic in 3, 2, 1. The dashboard calmed from scarlet to amber. Not perfect, but no longer bleeding. The room exhaled as if the building had lungs. Kyle returned, breathless. Jerome pushed the emergency rotation script, 12 minutes for the full sweep. He says to tell you he still owes you for the barbecue place you recommended. Tell him he paid in gratitude already, I said. Move the batch processor window by 2 minutes tonight to give us margin. Add a note that says why, not what. Why? The juniors nodded. I saw one of them smile at the word why, like the permission to use that word felt new and slightly illicit. For the next half hour we worked. No heroics, no shouting, just call and response between people who had once built a system and people who were learning that systems are not charts, they are conversations that last for years. When the worst of the red had faded, I leaned on the desk and let my shoulders drop an inch. The new product manager approached, cheeks still high with adrenaline. Can you stay until we are fully clear, he asked. I checked the time. My 4-hour minimum had started when the wire cleared. I told him the truth. Yes, for now, I said, then at the rate I stated. He swallowed and nodded and did not argue. I almost liked him then. Sloane appeared at the edge of the group. She had swapped the smile for neutrality. It did not make her kinder. I would like to speak with you privately, she said. Not now, I said. We are in the middle of something real. She tipped her head. There have been allegations, she said, that you have maintained undocumented processes and personal vendor relationships that constitute a risk, that you purposely withheld knowledge to maintain power. Everyone within earshot went very still. Accusations travel better than truth. I kept my tone even. We are in a live incident, I said. If you have questions about governance, schedule a meeting for the afternoon and invite legal. In the meantime, do not distract the people who are saving your quarter. I turned away before she could answer and looked at the board again. The amber was fading to green. The metric that always made me smile ticked up. Not transactions processed, not money captured. The one labeled mean time to understanding. It is not a real metric, but it should be. It is the moment when a person who is clicking buttons starts to see the shape of the thing they are touching. We reached a stable state just before 10:30. I sent a short summary to the executive channel. Primary gateway stabilized via temporary whitelist. Certificate rotation in progress. Batch settlement will be protected. We will need to rebuild the gateway after hours with the correct chain. I added 3 bullets under a heading that said lessons we already paid for. The bullets were not about what to click. They were about why our world looked the way it looked. Colin called me back upstairs. The board had adjourned. The room smelled faintly of ozone, as if a storm had stalked through and only the charge remained. Thank you, he said. You are paying me, I said. He gave one short laugh. It had no humor, but it did have respect. What will it take to keep this from happening again? It will happen again if you keep optimizing away experience, I said. You need a real program for knowledge preservation. Not a wiki page. A practice. A set of interviews with the people who remember the reasons. A way to tell the next generation why the map has strange symbols in the corners. You also need to stop treating age as a cost center. He looked out at the glass city. Sloane stood near the door. She did not move closer, and she did not move away. She looked like a person doing math in public. We can talk about programs, he said. We can talk about programs after the wire for my acceleration is irrevocably complete, I said. We can talk about programs after you send a clean letter confirming that my termination is not for cause. We can also talk about something else you will hear soon whether I am in the room or not. He turned back. What is that? Someone in compliance has been watching your optimization efforts with a careful eye, I said. I do not know who, I do not need to know, but they have documents. If you continue to push out your older people and then celebrate the cost savings, you will wake up to an investigation and a headline you cannot pay to edit. If you want to avoid that future, reverse course before the story writes itself. There was a long pause, not the pause of indecision. The pause of a person hearing their last easy option leave the room. "We will review policies," he said. "Good," I said. Then I checked my watch. My minimum ends at 2:02. After that, my rate changes. "If you wish to be economical, I suggest we line up the vendor rebuild for tonight and the letter for this afternoon." He nodded again. When he spoke, his tone had the old cadence for a moment, the one that used to belong to a builder. "Melia," he said, "for what it is worth, there was a time when I would have fought to keep people like you from ever needing a clause like that." "Then keep the next me," I said. "Make it so they never need one." I left him to his window and his thoughts. Back on 27, the team was quieter. Not silent. Settled. Some of the juniors were taking notes. Kyle was sketching a diagram on a whiteboard with arrows and small labels that said this only exists because of that, and talk to Marissa at the bank if the timing drifts. I took a photo of the whiteboard and sent it to my personal archive, not because I needed it, because memory is not just facts. It is the habit of keeping the facts where others can find them. My phone buzzed one more time. A message from an unknown address. The writing was careful and neat. "Thank you for standing up," it read. "Some of us have been collecting things for months. If they try to pretend this is about performance, we will help you show otherwise." I did not reply. Whistleblowers move safer when they think they are ghosts. I slid the phone back into my pocket and looked around the floor that had been my home for most of my adult life. It looked the same. It was not the same. Somewhere inside the building, a clock had shifted. Somewhere inside me, a weight had moved from a shoulder to a hand. 1 minute, I thought. 60 seconds. A nick in time that most people would forget by lunch. I would not forget. I had turned that minute into a lever. At 2:02, my 4-hour minimum would end. Before then, we would schedule the rebuild and the vendor confirmations, and we would write down the why behind 3 choices that had saved us today and would save someone else later. After 2:02, nothing about me would be the same in any ledger that mattered. I stood, rolled my shoulders, and went back to work. The first time I heard the phrase golden parachute, I was 29 years old, sitting in a conference room with a stack of papers that smelled of fresh ink. The founders of Novacor looked more like exhausted students than future titans. They wore hoodies, had eyes rimmed red from sleepless nights, and still argued about variable names like philosophers disputing theology. They had begged me to join. The platform was failing, money was bleeding, and none of them understood how to keep a financial exchange from eating itself alive. They said things like culture fit and vision, but what they really meant was, "Please don't let us die before Series B." I remember leaning back in that chair, pen resting between my fingers, listening to them stumble through promises. Equity, options, title, a seat at the table. None of it mattered if the company collapsed. None of it mattered if they decided later that experience was a cost they could not afford. So I asked for Clause 14C. At the time it sounded absurd, maybe even paranoid. Any unilateral reduction in compensation, including but not limited to docking of pay, shall constitute grounds for immediate good reason termination and trigger acceleration of all unvested equity at current fair market value. The lawyer they hired to close the deal squinted at me like I had spoken a dead language. "That is not standard," he said. "Exactly," I replied. "That is why it protects me." He wanted to argue, but the founders were desperate, and I had something they did not: a reputation for fixing disasters that should have buried companies twice their size. They signed. 12 years later, that clause had detonated like a buried charge under the foundation of the building. I sat in my office on the 27th floor, the PDF glowing on my laptop. My fingers hovered over the trackpad, scrolling through annotations I had made over the years. I remembered every highlight, every note. Some were written at 3 in the morning after an outage, some in airports when I thought the company might sell, some on nights when I wondered if all of this was worth it. The umbrella archive was not just contracts. It was memory. Screenshots of system dashboards from incidents no one wanted to talk about. Copies of board presentations that were quietly revised before public release. Slack transcripts where young executives joked about weeding out the old guard. Expense reports that showed lavish dinners billed as training. Most people kept souvenirs from their careers: a mug, a plaque, a blurry photo from a team outing. I kept evidence, because I knew one day I would need it. Kyle messaged me on the secure channel we still maintained, one the IT team had forgotten existed because it was built before half of them had graduated high school. "Are you sure you want to light all this up?" "It already lit itself," I typed back. They docked me. "Clause 14C is live. There is no way back." He sent an emoji of a storm cloud. then another with lightning. That was our code. Trouble coming, but also power. I leaned back and closed my eyes for a moment. I could hear the hum of the servers through the floor. Novacore loved to say our infrastructure was in the cloud, but I knew the truth. The heart of it all still pulsed 2 levels down, behind walls of steel and biometric locks. I had stood in that room more times than I could count. I had felt the cold air of industrial cooling units bite my skin at 2 in the morning. I had patched cables with hands that shook from caffeine. The building remembered me, even if the people no longer did. A knock at the glass made me open my eyes. Sloane was standing there again, arms crossed, expression perfectly neutral. She did not wait for me to invite her in. She stepped inside like she owned the air. "You are making this difficult," she said. "I thought that was your specialty," I replied. Her jaw tightened. "We can make this disappear. The doc was a mistake. We will reverse it, add a note. Nobody has to know." I closed the laptop slowly, deliberately. "The mistake," I said, "was believing you could erase 17 years of contribution with a stopwatch. You are clinging to the past," she said. "This company has to evolve. The board wants speed. They want efficiency." "Efficiency without knowledge is collapse with better branding," I said. "You can fire every senior engineer, but you cannot fire gravity. Systems fail because people forget why they were built the way they were." She smiled faintly. "You sound nostalgic." "No," I said. "I sound accurate." Her tablet pinged. She glanced down, and for the first time I saw her expression falter, just a flicker. But I knew what she had read, the notice from legal, the one confirming the trigger event. Clause 14C was no longer just a sentence in a contract. It was a bomb going off in real time. She tried to recover. "We can fight this. You do not want a war." I stood, walked to the window, and looked down at the city. Cars moved like blood cells through veins of asphalt. I thought about all the transactions pulsing through our systems right now, trades worth billions flowing through lines of code I had touched with my own hands. "I wrote that clause because I knew one day someone like you would come," I said without turning. "So yes, I do want a war. I already won it 12 years ago. Today is just the day you realize it." Silence. Then the sound of her heels retreating across the floor. When the door shut, I breathed easier. Not because I was safe. I was not. But because the archive was awake. Umbrella had more than contracts. It had automation. At 9:02, it had begun sending timed packets, each one carrying documents, each one sent to recipients who would understand their weight. Some went to regulators, some to journalists, some to allies inside the company who had grown tired of being silent. The first domino had already fallen, and the sound of it tipping was louder than anything Sloane Carter could hear yet. At 9:17, my inbox began to echo with auto-forwards I had not seen in years. It was like hearing old ghosts call your name. Umbrella was awake. Every artifact I had preserved now moved along its path. Contracts, Slack logs, expense files, meeting notes typed in haste by assistants who thought no one would keep them. They were no longer silent files hidden in my archive. They were packets, timed and sequenced, slipping into the hands of people who understood leverage better than code. I had designed it like a cascade. The first wave went to compliance bodies who could not ignore legal triggers. The second went to allies inside the company, engineers, architects, operations veterans who still remembered why our world functioned the way it did. The third was the insurance policy, journalists, regulators, watchdogs. They would not receive everything yet. Only fragments, just enough to remind Novacore that silence was not guaranteed. The Umbrella archive was never meant to destroy. It was meant to remind. Systems do not collapse because of noise, they collapse because of silence. I leaned back in my chair and watched as my phone lit again. Messages from people I had not heard from in years. "Did you really pull it? Clause 14C? Holy hell. You are a legend. Not all were supportive. You are insane. You will burn the whole thing down. They will crush you for this." I answered none of them. Words spent on panic were words stolen from strategy. A calendar invite popped up, red and urgent. Emergency meeting with the board. 11 a.m. I smiled. They were faster than I expected. While I waited, I opened one of the forwarded files. It was a chat log from 3 years ago. Sloane had not been there yet, but the culture that had invited her certainly had. In the log, a young VP had written, "If we trim the graybeards, we save 30% in comp. Half of them are holding tribal knowledge we can just document." Another had replied with laughing emojis. I had saved that log the night it was written, not because I needed it then, but because memory is never wasted. Now it was in the inbox of the company's own diversity and ethics committee. Umbrella had no mercy and no favorites. The hum of the office outside my door grew restless. People could feel it even if they did not know why. Engineers sense instability like sailors sense a storm. A subtle pressure in the air, the weight of unseen currents. At 10:04 my phone rang, not a message, not a notification, a call. The number was blocked, I answered. Ms. Rhodes. The voice was calm, clipped with the tone of someone who had been practicing neutrality for a long time. Legal. Yes, you are aware of the clause you triggered. Of course. You understand the financial magnitude. I wrote it knowing exactly what the magnitude would be. Pause, a breath over the line. There are options. Arbitration, private settlement, we can explore terms. Terms require trust, I said, and Novacor used up that currency at 8:59:47. Another pause, then quietly, this will escalate. It already has, I said, and ended the call. By 10:30 I was summoned again to the executive floor. The boardroom lights were dimmer than usual, as if someone thought shadows made bad news softer. Faces filled the wall screen, a mosaic of calm panic. Collins sat at the head, but his shoulders slouched like he was leaning against an invisible wind. Varina was beside him, papers spread like armor. Sloane stood, not sitting, a predator circling. Ms. Rhodes, one of the directors began, a man with silver hair and a voice polished by decades of shareholder meetings. You have placed us in a difficult position. I did not dock my pay, I said evenly. Your policy did, your managers enforced it, your system logged it. All I did was insist you honor your own signature. Surely we can find a resolution, another voice added, a number that is less destabilizing. I already have a number, I said, 91.4 million. That is the market value of the equity you agreed to accelerate. Anything less is not a resolution. It is theft with better lighting. The silver-haired man sighed. If this becomes public. It already is, I interrupted. Your compliance inbox has the notice. Regulators have the trigger document. Umbrella sent it at 9:02. You are negotiating in a world where the story is already written. Sloane slammed her tablet onto the table. You think you are clever, she said, her voice rising for the first time. You think your little archive makes you untouchable, but this is extortion, plain and simple. You held knowledge hostage. You sabotaged documentation. You built systems no one else could run. That is not brilliance. That is a criminal act. The words hung like knives in the air. The board shifted uncomfortably. I leaned forward. If I had sabotaged, Novacor would be dark right now. If I had withheld knowledge, your payments would already be failing. Instead, you are still alive because I built redundancies, because I trained people who are still here, because I chose to keep you standing. The only hostage here is truth, and you have been starving it. Silence, heavy, the kind that cuts deeper than shouting. Varina finally spoke. Sloane, enough. The facts are clear. Clause 14C is enforceable. If we fight, we bleed money in legal fees and reputation. If we settle, we pay once and move on. Sloane's face flushed with anger, but she said nothing. I sat back. You have a choice. Pay me what is owed, and I will consult to stabilize the systems you are about to break. Refuse and Umbrella's third wave goes out. The one with board transcripts. The one with jokes about age and cost-cutting. The one regulators will not treat as a misunderstanding. The silver-haired director rubbed his forehead. This is blackmail. This is accountability, I said. The meeting ended without a decision, but I did not need one yet. Time was my ally. Every hour that passed without resolution made Umbrella louder. Back in my office, I stared at the skyline. 17 years, that was how long I had given Novacor. 17 years of nights, weekends, birthdays missed, relationships strained. And now, in 1 minute, everything had shifted. But the truth was this: the contract was never just protection. It was prophecy. I had seen the shape of this future long ago, when young executives laughed about replacing wisdom with dashboards, when efficiency became a religion, when memory was treated like clutter. They thought I was paranoid. Maybe I was, but paranoia built the parachute. Paranoia saved me, and paranoia was about to teach them how expensive silence could be. The first domino fell at exactly 9:02. I did not hear it, not in the physical sense. There was no sound of wood tipping or metal clattering. It was digital, precise, instantaneous. The notifications were already rolling through inboxes I had not touched in years, into accounts I had created under aliases no one remembered. Umbrella was awake, fully awake now. I leaned back in my chair and let my eyes travel across the monitors. The dashboards flickered with real-time alerts, small and seemingly harmless, each one carefully calibrated to inform without overwhelming. But hidden behind the surface were triggers I had built to illuminate the weaknesses in the company's operational chain. Each alert was a subtle, invisible hand, pushing executives, operators, and regulators toward the unavoidable conclusion. Novacor had been caught unprepared. It began with compliance. Automated messages arrived at the regulatory inbox. Not threatening, not aggressive, just factual. Docked pay recorded. Clause activated. Acceleration of equity required. Legal review advised. By 9:03, HR received a mirrored copy along with timestamps. A single line in the message read, "Notification, clause trigger is effective immediately. Action required." I watched the reactions begin. I could almost see them from the floor above in the offices where the board met daily. Their eyes flicked to monitors. Their thumbs hovered over phones. Their lips pressed together as they calculated, estimated, and panicked. The second wave went to the internal engineers who were still competent, still loyal, still aware. They were a small group, scattered, overlooked. I had given them access to Umbrella's secondary notifications. They would receive instructions, hints, reminders of their past work, context they were supposed to have forgotten. By the time Sloan realized what was happening, these engineers would be ready to stabilize anything the newcomers might disrupt. I sipped my coffee. It had gone cold hours ago, but I had no time to heat it. I could feel the pulse of the building through the soles of my feet. Servers humming, lights blinking, alerts pinging, the very air vibrating with the unseen tension of thousands of transactions flowing through lines of code that no one alive, besides a handful of us, truly understood. My phone buzzed. Kyle. They are noticing the compliance alerts. I typed back, wait for the confirmation. Let the panic settle, timing is everything. The dashboards were alive. Payment gateways, internal settlement systems, cloud authentication servers, certificate validation logs, all moving, all visible, all manageable if one knows where to touch. And I knew. By 9:05, the first phone calls came. Legal, HR, the board, words were clipped. Voices were controlled, but the tension seeped through every syllable. "We have received the notification," they said. "What is the scope? Who authorized this? Explain the acceleration." I did not answer, not yet. I let them sit in that uncertainty just long enough for the weight of the moment to take hold. A knock at my door. Sloan. She tried the door handle, found it locked, then rapped. Not too hard, not too soft. She knew etiquette even under pressure. "Ms. Rhodes," she said, voice calm, but there was a tremor, faint, beneath the surface. "We need to discuss." "You already received the notification," I said. "Clause 14C is live. Legal confirms. Your actions triggered it. Everything else is logistics." Her face paled slightly. She had rehearsed this confrontation in her head 100 times over the past 6 months, but she had not rehearsed this. She tried again. "We can reverse the doc, issue a correction. All can be handled internally." I leaned back in my chair, fingers steepled. "Correction is meaningless. The clause is explicit. The doc triggered immediate acceleration. You can reverse the number in payroll, but you cannot reverse the timeline, the documentation, the notice sent to compliance. Nor can you erase the copies sent to the internal team, nor the encrypted messages forwarded to regulators and auditors." Her lips pressed into a thin line. She looked like someone who had just realized that the chessboard had been set decades ago, and she had entered mid-game thinking she could claim victory. By 9:07, the first ripple reached the executive floor. The CFO was standing at her console, eyes flicking across emails, legal memos, and compliance logs. Her assistant hovered behind her, fingers trembling slightly over the keyboard. "What do we do?" whispered the assistant. "Keep your voice low," the CFO said. "Follow protocol, no sudden moves." I smiled faintly to myself. Protocol, that had been my gift, my protection, my weapon. Those who believed they controlled the protocol never realized it could be used against them. Meanwhile, Sloan was pacing outside my office. Small steps, careful, measured, trying to radiate calm she did not feel. Each step echoed in the hallway, a metronome counting down the seconds until the next message, the next alert, the next domino. At 9:08, a subtle buzz, not from a phone, not from the desk, from the system itself. The batch settlement monitor flashed amber, then red. Automated flags triggered, designed to catch anomalies that only the most senior engineers could interpret. Kyle messaged me, gateway latency spike. Edge cert mismatch. They do not know what to do. I typed back, let them feel it. Let them scramble. Maintain stability. Only minimal intervention. The board began to murmur. Small voices, questioning tones. Who authorized this? How do we stop it? The first cracks appeared in their composed veneer. I did not need to speak. The data spoke. The alert spoke. The chain of events I had designed spoke. By 9:10, compliance had escalated to the General Counsel. An emergency meeting invite appeared on my calendar. They wanted me there. They wanted explanations, assurances, and somehow control. Control was an illusion. I stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the city below. Cars glinted in the morning sun, oblivious to the storm inside a tower that dominated the skyline. Financial markets churned, oblivious to the tiny timestamp that had set off a cascade of alerts, memos, and decisions. 9011, another ping from Umbrella. The second wave. Internal engineers began receiving step-by-step instructions, guidance only I had the knowledge to provide. For a brief moment, the office was a theater of unseen hands moving pieces behind a curtain. I exhaled slowly. This was only the first domino, the first whisper of truth. Sloane had realized it. I could see the tension in her posture, the slight tightening of her jaw, the way her eyes darted to the nearest monitor, searching for salvation in numbers she could not control. By 90:15, the board had assembled in the video conference room. Faces filled the screen. They were composed, polished, professional, but the subtle tremor in their eyes betrayed the realization that the company they thought they owned was now dancing to a rhythm set decades ago by someone they underestimated. I took a seat at my desk. Fingers hovering over the keyboard, eyes scanning the screens, alerts still flashing, emails still arriving, Slack messages pinging quietly in the background. The system was alive, and so was I. The first domino had fallen. The others were lined up. And in the quiet hum of the 27th floor, I smiled, because once the first falls, there is no stopping the cascade. By 9:30, the first wave of external notifications had hit. Regulatory monitors pinged. Emails from SEC liaisons appeared in executive inboxes. The subject line was clinical, neutral, and yet terrifying. Clause 14C trigger activated, immediate action required. No one expected it. No one saw it coming. I watched from my desk as Varina picked up her phone, thumb hovering over the dial pad, hand shaking almost imperceptibly. Her assistant leaned in, whispered something I could not hear. She shook her head. Words were useless now, they were too late. Sloane had moved from pacing to standing frozen near the glass, eyes darting across monitors. She had prepared for many scenarios, but this was not one of them. The irony of a clause she had ignored 12 years ago now governing her every action was not lost on me. I took a sip of my cold coffee. Not bitter, not sweet, just the taste of inevitability. The second wave of umbrella messages began their quiet work. Internal engineers who had been overlooked, underestimated, or sidelined began to receive instructions. Step-by-step guidance on stabilizing failing services, correcting misconfigured certificate chains, and resetting critical batch processes. Only someone who remembered the system's history could execute these steps correctly. Kyle's message blinked on my secure channel, team responding. Gateway stabilized partially. New errors showing at edge nodes. Good, I typed back. Let them learn the lesson themselves. The board convened on video. Faces stared back at me from the screen. The CFO, the COO, a handful of directors, all trying to look calm while their company's financial arteries vibrated with uncertainty. Explain, said a silver-haired director. Voice measured, but the tremor was there. I leaned back. The clause you triggered is not about pay. It is about principle. You docked compensation unilaterally. I followed the contract. Acceleration of equity is automatic. Notifications were sent. Systems are in motion. You can argue, appeal, litigate, but the process cannot be stopped. A man in the background cleared his throat. How many employees are aware? I tilted my head. Not many, just those who needed to act. Whispers rose through the boardroom. Some faces paled. Others shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Realization spread. Novacor was exposed. On the floor below, Sloane tried to rally HR. Her tablet glowed red with alerts. She tapped commands that meant nothing. The system ignored them. My triggers were smart. They anticipated every naive action a newcomer could take. By 9:40, the first signs of panic emerged. Payment settlements lagged. Certificates failed partial validation. Dashboards flashed warnings. Junior engineers pressed buttons in confusion, trying to follow incomplete documentation. Only Kyle and the internal veterans knew the full path. Another ping. External auditors. Notifications of pending equity acceleration. Questions that required legal knowledge and historical context no one present had. I smiled faintly. Each alert was a lesson. Each email a nudge, each ping a reminder. They had forgotten that experience matters, that memory matters, that people like me are the backbone of systems that seem invincible until someone pulls a single string. Sloane finally approached the desk. Malia, this is insane. You are putting the company at risk. I am reminding it who built it, I said. She scowled. You are manipulating people. People? I tapped the table. Look at the alerts. Look at the emails. Look at the compliance logs. I am guiding them. I am teaching them to act correctly. Everything else is consequence. The board on the video screen began asking questions I had already answered in my messages. How long will it take to stabilize? Who is in charge of which critical systems? What about the edge nodes? I responded concisely. 4 hours minimum. All critical systems stable under current guidance. Manual intervention required for edge certificate rotation in 15 minutes. Stakeholders notified. Redundant backups verified. The CFO exhaled audibly. We cannot control this, she said. You can, I said, if you stop pretending that a dashboard equals understanding. By 9:50, the external vendor calls started. CloudKey, GlobalPay, and other partners reached out simultaneously. Systems they controlled were misaligned with ours because the internal triggers had not accounted for automatic failover. Only someone who had built the integration end-to-end could reconcile the conflicts. That someone was me. I coordinated with Kyle, issuing instructions in code and in plain English simultaneously. Engineers followed. Systems stabilized incrementally. The company remained operational, but only barely. By 10:02, the board had realized that their carefully constructed world had shifted. Their metrics no longer represented reality. Their junior hires could not interpret what was happening. The only person who could make sense of the chaos was the very person they had just tried to discard. Sloane's posture had changed. She stopped pacing. She stood rigid, like a soldier in formation, eyes narrowing. She understood, finally, that the first domino had fallen and I had pushed it. The internal whistleblowers began sending anonymous confirmations, tiny emails, notes, logs of past complaints, a subtle second layer of pressure that no one could immediately trace. The room was tense, silent except for the hum of servers and the faint tapping of keyboards. Every director on the video call had realized that this was not just a technical glitch. It was a demonstration of leverage, knowledge, and foresight. By 10:10, minor successes were recorded. Payment gateways were flowing. Critical nodes stabilized, but the moral weight had shifted. I was no longer just an employee. I was a force Novacore had underestimated. I leaned back in my chair, letting my eyes drift toward the city. Cars moved along the streets below, oblivious. Pedestrians walked without awareness. The world above ground continued as usual. Inside these walls, everything had changed. The first domino had fallen. The next was lined up, ready to tip. By 10:30, the floor vibrated with tension. The alerts had multiplied, each one a tiny flare marking another stress point in the network. Red lights on dashboards were flashing in patterns only comprehensible to someone who had memorized 17 years of operational flows. I had memorized them. Kyle hovered behind a bank of monitors, fingers dancing across keyboards. He did not speak, his movements alone conveyed understanding. Junior engineers ran from screen to screen, reading instructions, checking logs, adjusting nodes. Confusion and fear flitted across their faces. I did not intervene yet. Everything I had set in motion was designed to teach a lesson, to reveal the cracks in the system and in the people who managed it. I sipped my cold coffee. The taste was bitter, but it grounded me. The only thing that mattered now was control, precise and deliberate. The first priority, stabilize the payment gateways. Without them, the company would bleed reputation and revenue faster than any legal dispute. CloudKey had responded to the emergency ping. Jerome, the engineer I had trained during a late-night certificate incident 5 years ago, was on the line. He knew the pattern. Malia, he said, voice tight, we are seeing handshake failures across multiple nodes. TLS cert mismatch on production clusters. We need clearance. You have clearance, I said. Follow the sequence we discussed. Rotate the certificates in order. If a node fails, roll back and isolate. Document everything, but do not pause. Timing is critical. On the other line, GlobalPay had similar alerts. Their interface was failing partial authorizations. Merchants were calling. Transactions at risk. I contacted their primary support liaison directly, bypassing the junior reps who had no idea what was happening. By 10:40, the engineers were moving as one. One hand guided by me, the others moving instinctively. Red lights on monitors began to fade. Amber warnings turned green. The company's critical systems did not collapse entirely. Not yet, but the human cost was immediate. Sloane Carter was pacing the floor like a predator with no prey. Every alert she saw was a reminder of her miscalculation. Her team was scrambling, issuing memos, forwarding emails. Each action slowed the recovery because none of them truly understood what had failed or why. I moved between desks quietly, not because they needed leadership, they needed calibration. Guidance. The right word at the right time. I instructed a junior engineer to recompile a batch job, a task that had previously taken me 3 hours of careful debugging. He did it in 15 minutes because he was following the instructions I had encoded, step by step. The board on the video feed grew restless. Questions, queries, demands for updates. Their metrics were lying. The dashboards showed only partial truth. They could not see the undercurrents of instability. "You're stabilizing the system," one director said, voice tight. "Explain how this is possible. Your access was revoked." I smiled faintly. "Access is a physical thing. Knowledge is permanent. The system responds to both. I am providing only the latter." By 11, minor crises were contained. Edge nodes had been rotated, batch processors recalibrated, vendor approvals confirmed. The company was breathing, but it was like a patient on life support, alive but fragile. Kyle leaned in, whispering, "Still don't understand the dependencies. One misstep and the payment flows collapse again." "Exactly," I said. "That is why I am here." Meanwhile, Sloan had called a hasty meeting with HR and legal. I could hear her voice as she tried to rally them, attempted explanations, insisted on calm. But the words carried no weight. By now, the alerts were teaching lessons they could not unlearn. I monitored the external communications quietly. The first compliance emails to regulators had gone out. They were factual, neutral, impossible to ignore. A few analysts had already flagged anomalies. By the end of the day, someone would notice the pattern. Novacor had tried to minimize the role of experience and memory in operational systems, and it had failed spectacularly. The whistleblowers, emboldened, were beginning to submit anonymous reports. They detailed decisions made by HR, dismissals, warnings ignored. Every action Malia had documented years ago was now being validated, confirmed by multiple points of contact. By 11:30, Sloan's attempts to regain control had grown frantic. She had issued directives that contradicted one another, attempted to override automated instructions, and demanded logs that had already been forwarded. Every intervention slowed the system instead of stabilizing it. I moved to the main dashboard, observing the flow. Certificates, edge nodes, payment processors, batch settlements. Systems stabilized sequentially under my guidance. Minor alerts persisted, but the backbone was secure. Novacor was alive, just barely. The first lesson had been delivered. The message was clear: knowledge is power, memory is survival. Dashboards cannot replace years of experience. Decisions made to optimize costs at the expense of institutional memory will inevitably fail. At 11:45, I paused. Time to escalate the next layer. Vendors, partners, and internal architects needed additional guidance for non-critical systems. The second wave of instructions began to flow, each packet encrypted, each alert carefully timed. The office was quiet now, except for the hum of machines. People worked methodically, following instructions they barely understood. Panic was still simmering in corners of the floor. Sloan's presence was oppressive, but powerless. By noon, most of the critical systems were stable. Novacor had survived the initial chaos, but the board and executives were exhausted, humiliated, and beginning to comprehend the depth of their misjudgment. I leaned back in my chair, observing. The first domino had fallen. The system burned, but under my control. And the company had no choice but to pay attention to the one person they had tried to discard. By 12:15, the floor had settled into a tense rhythm. The initial chaos had been contained, but every movement, every keystroke carried weight. Junior engineers typed quickly, checking logs, resetting nodes, confirming alerts. They had no understanding of the full network, only fragments guided by the directions I provided. Every instruction I sent was precise, deliberate, enough to prevent collapse but designed to teach lessons. Sloan Carter was still circling, pacing like a predator without prey. She tried to project calm, but the tension was visible. Her tablet flashed with alerts she could not interpret. Commands she issued to it were ignored because the system had already responded automatically to triggers only veterans could execute. I moved through the floor quietly, observing, not to assert authority, not to intimidate, but to assess, calibrate, correct. My eyes flicked from screen to screen, nodes stabilizing, certificates rotating, payment gateways reconnected. Batch processors recalibrated. Minor errors still lingered, but the critical backbone of Novacor had survived the morning's onslaught. Kyle appeared at my side, laptop in hand. Edge nodes have all been verified. Certificates are rotating successfully. One minor misalignment on the European cluster, but it's contained. Good, I said. Make sure the logs document it. If anyone audits this later, they will need to see the sequence, the decisions, and the corrections. Understanding is everything. Meanwhile, the board on video remained tense. Directors and executives typed furiously, eyes darting between alerts, emails, and the screens showing the live status of transactions. Every red light, every amber warning was a silent accusation. They had underestimated experience. They had underestimated memory. And now they were paying for it in panic and stress. At 12:30, I coordinated with external vendors. Jerome at CloudKey was issuing whitelists. Samantha at GlobalPay was confirming authorizations. Each call, each instruction was a thread in a web I had built years ago. Threads designed to hold together systems even when the company tried to optimize itself into collapse. I allowed myself a small smile. The irony was exquisite. Sloan and her team had celebrated efficiency. They had counted costs. They had minimized old knowledge as unnecessary. And yet the only thing keeping NovaCore alive was precisely what they tried to discard. Experience, memory, people who understood systems in depth. By 12:45, minor crises had been resolved. Gateways were flowing, certificates aligned, batch processors stabilized, payment flows resumed. The system breathed again, but the human component was exhausted. Sloan was visibly frustrated, her attempts to assert control ineffective. The junior engineers were nervous but functioning. Kyle and a handful of internal veterans moved with precision. I walked to the central dashboard. Alerts were still blinking here and there, minor issues easily corrected with guidance. The building hummed, servers spinning quietly beneath the floor. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the storm contained within glass walls. At 1 o'clock, the board called another emergency session. They were desperate for updates, reassurances, and explanations. They wanted someone accountable, someone to blame, someone to restore the illusion of control. I joined the video feed. The faces were composed, professional, but their eyes betrayed exhaustion, fear, and recognition. Recognition of something they had failed to appreciate, the value of knowledge and the cost of underestimating it. I am here, I said. Critical systems are stable. Minor alerts are being managed. Payment gateways, edge nodes, batch processors are operational. Internal teams are following guidance. External vendors are synchronized. The network is stable for now. Silence. The board processed the report. Some leaned back, absorbing. Others whispered to assistants. Sloan's jaw tightened. She was searching for leverage where none existed. "You are controlling the system," said the CFO, voice tight, "despite your status as a former employee." "I am not controlling," I said. "I am guiding. The system follows rules. People follow knowledge. Both are required to survive. If one fails, the other fails." They nodded slowly. Some comprehension arrived. Others were still resisting. I sent messages to the internal whistleblowers. They confirmed compliance had received the documentation and that regulators were aware of the triggered clause. This was not public yet. The company still had a chance to settle internally, but the pattern was clear. Any attempt to ignore, to downplay, or to suppress knowledge would be exposed. By 1:15, the major technical crises were contained. Payments were moving. Certificates aligned. Critical batch processes operational. Minor alerts were being logged, but nothing that could threaten the backbone. Kyle reported in. All vendors confirmed, documentation sent, internal teams in position, no further immediate issues. Good, I said. Maintain monitoring. Do not intervene unnecessarily. Let them learn the dependencies and the costs of ignoring institutional knowledge. The first domino had fallen fully. The consequences were cascading. Executives were beginning to see the fragility of their decisions. HR and Sloan Carter had lost confidence. The board was reacting cautiously to the message that efficiency without experience is disaster waiting to happen. I stood, stretching slightly. 4 hours minimum on the clock. After that, I would be billing them. Not for saving them, for teaching them, for reminding them of the value they had ignored. By 1:30, the floor was quiet but tense. Engineers focused on guidance. Alerts ticked softly on screens. The system was breathing, but human eyes were sharp, scanning for the next anomaly. I allowed myself a thought, a small one. 1 minute, 60 seconds. That was all it took to trigger a chain of events. A single minute that unbalanced executives, HR, and the company itself. 1 minute, 12 years in preparation, and now the first domino had fallen. The next would tip soon. By 2 o'clock, the operational crisis had subsided, but a new storm was brewing. Alerts no longer screamed at the engineers. Instead, an invisible current ran through the floor, tension pressing at every shoulder, every spine. Sloane Carter moved among her team like a chess player searching for a winning move, but all the pieces she relied on had already been shifted. The first email arrived at 2:03, not from internal systems, not from payroll, not from legal, from an anonymous sender within the company. You've underestimated the people you dismissed. Check your archives. I smiled. Timing, as always, was everything. Sloane's tablet pinged simultaneously. She glanced at it and immediately knew that something beyond her control had entered the fray. Her eyes narrowed. She waved to Varina, the CFO, who tried to intercept the incoming messages, but they had already spread across secure internal channels. The whistleblower was active. Documents that exposed the HR policy of systematically removing senior engineers were now appearing in inboxes that mattered: board members, internal auditors, and select journalists. Sloane stormed into my space. "Who did this?" she demanded. "This is sabotage. You've created an environment of chaos." I shook my head slowly. "Not sabotage. Accountability. Remember, you tried to optimize experience out of the system. Now the system speaks." She scoffed. "This is extortion. You are blackmailing the company." "No," I said. "This is the truth. You have taken decisions intended to save costs, decisions that remove institutional knowledge, and you have ignored their consequences. The documents you are seeing are proof of what happens when knowledge is disregarded. That is all." Meanwhile, the internal communications channels were alive. Engineers who had been sidelined and dismissed years ago were sending confirmations and annotations to the whistleblower's secure inbox. Names, dates, policy violations, emails documenting conversations about trimming senior staff, they were all there. Sloane's face had turned a shade paler. Her tablet pinged again. Another wave. Regulatory notices had been triggered by the whistleblower's submissions. Compliance was now fully engaged. Kyle approached me quietly. "They don't understand. They think they can contain it. They can't." "Good," I said. "Let them scramble. Every second counts." I pulled up the boardroom video feed. Directors were already receiving fragments of the reports, their expressions tightening with each incoming message. The silver-haired director was now leaning back in his chair, hands rubbing his temples. He understood that this was no ordinary incident. This was a revelation of systemic risk and corporate negligence. Sloane tried to speak during the video call. "This is being handled," the CEO cut her off. "Handled? This is evidence, and the people submitting it are inside our walls." "How did this happen?" I let the silence linger. Let them feel the weight of unpreparedness. By 2:30, the whistleblower reports had reached multiple external regulators. The second domino had fallen, and the consequences would soon extend beyond the floor of the building. I instructed Kyle to coordinate with the internal veterans. Every notification that came through, every incoming question, was addressed with precise guidance. I kept the junior engineers moving, stabilizing the minor alerts still flickering across dashboards. The system was stable, but human attention was stretched thin. Sloane paced. HR tried to rally, but they were fragmented. Emails sent without context, memos issued that contradicted one another. Panic had a sound, and it was audible in the tapping of keyboards, in hushed conversations, in the shuffling of feet. I sent a message to the anonymous whistleblower: "Continue. Timing is perfect." They are noticing now. Shortly after, another alert from regulatory monitoring hit the board members' inboxes: potential discrimination and age-based staffing reduction documented. The board froze. They realized the severity. This was not just operational failure. This was exposure. Sloane turned to the CEO. "We can negotiate, control the narrative. We can fix this internally." He shook his head slowly. "You have no control. The reports are out. The regulators have visibility. This is no longer internal." I remained silent, watching. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I had prepared for it. Every document in Umbrella, every procedural note, every encrypted instruction, everything had led to this. By 2:45, whispers reached my desk. Analysts were discussing the potential fallout, risk exposure, and reputational damage. Sloane's previous confidence was gone. She moved from desk to desk, giving instructions that were ignored or misunderstood. I typed into the secure channel. "They are reacting. Let them understand. Do not intervene unless critical." The next wave of emails hit the board and HR at exactly 2:50. Copies of internal communications showing deliberate policy targeting senior staff were now in their inboxes. Evidence, documented and undeniable, linking HR strategy to systemic risk and potential discrimination. Sloane's jaw tightened. She realized that the situation was no longer controllable. Every action she took was measured against documents she could not erase, messages she could not retract, and the very clause that had triggered all of this. By 3 o'clock, the company was in a state of tense equilibrium. Critical systems were stable thanks to my guidance. The board and executives were scrambling to assess the exposure. HR was fragmented and ineffective. Sloane was cornered. I leaned back. This was the point where the counterstrike revealed its power. The whistleblower had brought to light what HR and Sloane had tried to bury. The first wave was operational. The second wave was reputational. The dominoes were falling, and the company had nowhere to hide. I checked the clock. 2 hours and 40 minutes into my minimum engagement. Every minute counted. I had stabilized the systems, orchestrated the flows, and now I waited to see the consequences of transparency and accountability ripple through Novacor. By 3:15, the pattern was undeniable. The plot twist had hit. Sloane's authority was undermined, HR's credibility shattered, and the board was now forced to confront decisions they had long ignored. My role was clear: guide the company through operational stability while allowing the repercussions of their misjudgments to unfold fully. The first domino had fallen. The second had toppled. The third was aligned. And I had the lever. By 3:30, the office had transformed from a calm operational hub into a theater of quiet panic. Every alert that had flickered on dashboards earlier now carried weight, not just technical significance, but political consequence. Whistleblower reports had circulated internally and externally, leaving executives scrambling to assess exposure. Sloane Carter was still pacing, her usual calm veneer stripped away. Every glance at a monitor was a reminder that her carefully orchestrated policies had been documented and broadcast to those who had the authority and the will to act. The emails flowing into board members' inboxes included internal memos, Slack conversations, and spreadsheet logs detailing her targeted removal of senior engineers. Each document reinforced a narrative she could not control. I watched from my desk, observing, guiding, stabilizing. That was my role. Not as a hero, not as a savior, but as a force ensuring that systems did not fail while lessons were delivered. Knowledge was the bridge between chaos and stability, and I held both ends. Kyle appeared at my side, leaning over the bank of screens. "They are trying to push back," he whispered. "Sloane is calling meetings, trying to assert authority. Board members are sending frantic messages to each other." "Good," I said. "Let them experience the consequences. Do not interfere unless the system is at risk." The third wave of Umbrella's automated instructions had begun, not operational this time, but narrative. Compiled documents showing HR's internal discussions, annotated with dates and participants, had been delivered to select external regulators and media contacts. The story was no longer speculative. It was tangible, undeniable. Sloane's face paled as the first regulator emails appeared on her tablet. Compliance flagged potential discriminatory policies. Notifications of possible violations of labor laws were highlighted. For the first time, her confident smile faltered. She had been a predator, but now the hunt had turned. One of the directors on the video conference called out, "This is escalating beyond internal control. Are there steps to contain this? How do we manage the fallout?" I leaned back, letting the silence answer. My phone buzzed, a confirmation from Kyle that the minor system anomalies were under control, all critical nodes stable. I typed a short message: "No further intervention needed. Focus on documentation." At 3:45, Sloane attempted to approach me directly. "Malia, we can negotiate. There has to be a way to," I cut her off. "There is no negotiation without acknowledgement. You attempted to erase experience. You attempted to optimize knowledge out of existence. The documents you are seeing are a reflection of that choice. You cannot negotiate with facts, only respond to them." Her jaw tightened. She realized that her authority had been undermined in the most public and verifiable way possible. The internal team, guided by the instructions I had provided, was performing flawlessly. The juniors were executing the steps I had given them, maintaining operational stability even as Sloane's directives collided with reality. Another email arrived. External regulators had forwarded copies of the whistleblower documentation to senior oversight committees. The report highlighted not just operational mismanagement, but policies targeting senior staff. HR's credibility was being dismantled, piece by piece. Sloane's tablet pinged repeatedly, each alert a reminder that control had slipped through her fingers. She looked to the CEO for support, but the executive was pale, his fingers drumming a nervous rhythm on the conference table. Even he recognized the momentum was no longer in their favor. Kyle leaned over again. "They're panicking, but we're stable. No system failures. All critical paths maintained." "Good," I said. "Let them experience their own decisions. The stability is preserved because of knowledge, not because of authority. Let them learn the cost of dismissing it." By 4 o'clock, the internal chaos had transitioned to tense vigilance. The engineers moved with precision, monitoring alerts and executing contingency steps exactly as I had instructed. Minor anomalies continued to appear but were managed instantly. The operational backbone of Novacore remained intact. Sloane attempted one final intervention. She called an emergency video meeting, demanding explanations for every email, every alert, every document now circulating. Directors and HR representatives scrambled to provide answers, but each attempt revealed further inconsistencies, contradictions, and gaps in knowledge. The room vibrated with the tension of people realizing they had lost control. I joined the call briefly. Critical systems are stabilized. Operationally, no immediate risk. The next issue is human: accountability, oversight, and the consequences of decisions made without understanding. The director who had questioned me earlier looked directly into the camera. "Is this intentional? Are we being manipulated?" I smiled faintly. "Not manipulated, informed. Knowledge is power. Ignoring it has consequences. This is a lesson in awareness, experience, and responsibility." Sloane's face had turned a shade of gray. The realization was complete. She had miscalculated. The company's exposure, reputational, operational, regulatory, was now undeniable. Every document, every alert, every communication reinforced the truth she had tried to suppress. By 4:30, the room settled into a tense equilibrium. The system was stable, the emails delivered, the whistleblower documentation in place. Sloane and her team could no longer dictate the narrative. The board could only respond, adapt, and prepare for the fallout. I sat back, letting my eyes drift across the monitors. Alerts were minimal, systems stable, and the company's infrastructure secure. The operational storm had passed. The reputational and regulatory storms were now unfolding, guided by evidence they could not deny. Kyle leaned in. "It's working. They see it now." I nodded. The plot twist had taken hold. Sloane's authority undermined, HR discredited, the board exposed to the consequences of ignoring experience. And through it all, the company's critical operations remained intact, stabilized by the very knowledge they had attempted to erase. By 4:45, I allowed myself a small breath. The counterstrike was complete. The lessons had been delivered. The dominoes had fallen. The first operational storm had been survived. The human storm had begun. The hum of the building had changed. It was no longer the quiet tension of a technical crisis. It was the heavy, steady vibration of reckoning. Every system I had guided through the chaos was stable, but human attention was fractured, stretched thin, processing what had just occurred. The dominoes of truth were settling into place. I sat at my desk, scrolling through the logs from the morning. Each email, each alert, each notification from Umbrella told the story in a language the board and HR could not yet fully read. They could see the results, feel the pressure, but comprehension lagged behind. Kyle appeared at my side, holding a tablet with operational summaries. "Everything critical is stable. The remaining minor alerts are being managed. External vendors confirmed all flows. Compliance reports are filed, but they're asking for explanations. Board wants a plan." "Good," I said. "Let them experience the cost of ignoring institutional memory." I stood and walked to the window, looking down at the city. Cars flowed like blood through streets, oblivious to the currents inside the building. Traders in downtown offices were unaware of the minute that had triggered billions in decisions and communications. 1 minute, one simple, overlooked minute, and everything had changed. The board convened again, this time in person for the first time since the morning's cascade. Faces were drawn, pale, tense. They had seen the operational outcomes, but the human and reputational consequences were only beginning to hit. The CEO spoke first. "We need a full assessment. What happened, why it happened, and what steps we take to prevent recurrence." I leaned back calm. "You already have a partial assessment. The rest is about human decision-making. You optimized out experience. You ignored institutional knowledge. Systems survived because knowledge persisted outside your control. Human error amplified. Policies intended to streamline instead created vulnerability. This is the reckoning. Sloane Carter shifted in her seat. She opened her mouth, paused, and then closed it again. The words were inadequate. The evidence, now widely circulated internally and externally, spoke louder than any explanation she could offer. I continued. The only way to prevent recurrence is to implement a structured knowledge preservation initiative, not a wiki page, not a dashboard, a process that records decisions, context, reasoning, and institutional memory. A program that ensures those who follow can act effectively when crises occur. A program that treats experience as an asset, not a cost. Varina, the CFO, nodded slowly. We can fund such a program, training, documentation, mentorship, but we will need guidance to structure it properly. I allowed myself a small smile. I will provide that guidance, but it will require active participation from those who have survived and learned over the years. Everyone who was dismissed or sidelined cannot be ignored. They hold the maps that tell you why the systems are as they are and what to do when chaos strikes. Sloane's jaw tightened. She understood now, fully, that her previous strategies had been short-sighted. The company's survival had depended on the very people she had tried to remove, on knowledge she had dismissed. And now, the initiative I proposed would formalize their importance, ensuring that she could not repeat the same mistakes. I paused, letting the weight of the message sink in. The room was silent, each executive processing the lesson. They had survived the operational storm. They had felt the first waves of reputational and regulatory pressure. Now they were confronting the human cost, the price of ignoring experience. By 3:30, plans began to take shape. The board approved immediate funding for knowledge preservation, beginning with critical teams and systems. Internal veterans were consulted. Meetings were scheduled to document procedures, decisions, and historical context. Engineers who had been dismissed were offered positions to contribute their insights. I oversaw the initial session myself. Kyle coordinated logistics. Junior engineers observed, took notes, and began to understand the depth of what they had experienced that morning. The minor alerts that had persisted throughout the day now served as teaching tools, illustrating not just technical failures but the consequences of bypassing human understanding. Sloane sat quietly at the back of the room. Her posture had stiffened. She understood at last that the system alone could not sustain the company. Knowledge, memory, and human judgment were equally vital. Her previous policies, meant to streamline efficiency, had nearly destroyed them. By 4 o'clock, the first wave of documentation had begun. Procedures were being recorded. Annotations, historical context, reasons behind architectural decisions, all were being captured. Engineers contributed, shared stories, and corrected gaps in understanding. The company's institutional memory was being reconstructed, now formalized, no longer dependent on scattered individuals or undocumented habits. I walked among the team, guiding where needed. Minor system alerts flared occasionally, but each was resolved without incident. The operational backbone was secure. The lessons were being documented. The company, fragile but alive, was beginning to understand the cost of undervaluing experience. By 4:30, I called Kyle over. Send a status report to the board. Include highlights of stabilization, operational continuity, and the initial scope of knowledge preservation. Make it clear, the company survived because of retained experience, not because of new hires or dashboards. He nodded and began compiling the report. I watched him, thinking about the contrast between those who understand and those who do not. Knowledge, once undervalued, was now the most precious currency in the room. The first steps of the knowledge reckoning were complete. Operational chaos had been contained. Human lessons were being internalized. Policies were being rewritten. Awareness was rising. And somewhere in the background, Sloane Carter understood that this reckoning would not be a one-time event. It would shape Novacor for years to come. I returned to my desk. 4 hours minimum was approaching. The operational phase would end, but the strategic phase, the one where the company fully recognized the value of institutional memory, was only beginning. I allowed myself a small, quiet smile. The first wave of consequences had been delivered. The system was stabilized. Knowledge had been preserved. The company had survived, but the cost was now visible to all. The knowledge reckoning was underway. By 5 o'clock, the floor had settled into a methodical rhythm. Alerts had become instructional tools. Engineers moved with precise purpose, executing steps that had been documented, rehearsed, and refined. The operational systems were stable. Payments flowed. Certificates rotated correctly. Batch processing ran without error. But the real change was not technical, it was human. The board, Sloan Carter, HR, and executives were now forced to confront the implications of their past decisions. Policies that had prioritized efficiency over experience had left gaps. They had underestimated the cost of ignoring institutional knowledge. The counter-strike and whistleblower revelations had made that clear. I began guiding the first official sessions of the Knowledge Preservation Initiative. Teams gathered in small groups. Internal veterans, engineers who had weathered previous crises, and newly reinstated senior staff shared their expertise. Every procedural decision, every architecture choice, every historical lesson was being documented. Kyle coordinated logistics. Each session had a defined structure: problem identification, reasoning behind solutions, potential consequences, and mitigation strategies. Junior engineers observed and took notes, absorbing insights that could never be captured by dashboards or automated alerts. Sloan sat quietly in the back. She no longer paced. She did not interrupt. For the first time, she was a witness rather than a director. She realized that authority without understanding was ineffective. Influence without knowledge was dangerous. And she understood that the company's survival had depended on the very people she had dismissed or marginalized. By 5:30, the first complete documentation packets were ready for review. Procedures were annotated with reasoning, historical context, and decision trees. Every step in critical systems was accounted for. Risk factors were identified, along with corrective measures for future crises. I circulated the first packets to board members and senior management. Each packet contained not just operational details, but the rationale behind decisions made over 17 years. The message was clear: knowledge is power, and neglecting it carries consequences. The board absorbed the information quietly. Some faces showed comprehension, others resignation. Sloan's expression hardened. She understood that her previous strategy, minimizing senior staff, optimizing costs, disregarding memory, was fundamentally flawed. This initiative now formalized what she had overlooked. By 6 o'clock, the initial phase of knowledge capture was complete. Systems were operationally stable. Human lessons were documented. Internal communication channels carried the archived logs, annotated procedures, and historical context. The knowledge reckoning was no longer theoretical. It was tangible. I walked among the teams, checking progress, answering questions, clarifying steps. Minor operational anomalies appeared, but were corrected immediately. The focus was now on understanding, not firefighting. By 6:30, the board held a debrief. Sloan Carter and HR presented summaries of past decisions. I added annotations, highlighting the rationale and consequences. Executives now saw the link between decisions, operational stability, and institutional memory. The impact of ignoring knowledge was undeniable. Kyle whispered to me, "They finally get it. They're starting to see why we survived." I nodded. Knowledge, preserved and applied, had saved the company, but the cultural shift was just beginning. Policies would be rewritten. Systems would be documented. Experience would be valued. Mistakes of the past would become lessons for the future. By 7 o'clock, the initial Knowledge Preservation Initiative was formally integrated into company operations. Teams had access to the complete documentation. Procedures were live in secure channels. Training sessions were scheduled. The company's institutional memory was no longer fragmented or at risk of being lost. Sloan Carter approached me quietly. Her tone was measured, subdued. "I understand. We underestimated what you preserved, what you planned, and what we lost by ignoring it." I said nothing. Understanding was enough. Actions, not words, would now determine outcomes. As the evening settled, the office quieted. Engineers continued working, but the frantic energy had been replaced by focused diligence. Critical systems were stable. Institutional memory was captured. The lessons were internalized. The knowledge reckoning was complete, at least for the initial phase. Novacor had survived. Systems, people, and processes had been preserved. The cost of ignoring experience had been paid, and the value of knowledge had been reaffirmed. I leaned back in my chair, eyes scanning the city skyline. 1 minute had triggered a cascade. 17 years of foresight had ensured stability. And through it all, I had maintained control, not through authority, but through understanding. The operational crisis had ended. The human reckoning had begun. The company would never be the same. The office smelled faintly of coffee and ozone, a residual scent from the morning's chaos. By 8 o'clock, the building had regained a quiet rhythm. Systems hummed steadily, alerts were minimal, and the teams moved with the precision of people who had learned the value of knowledge under pressure. I stood at the window of my office, looking down at the city streets below. Cars moved like blood cells through veins of concrete and asphalt. Pedestrians hurried along sidewalks, unaware that inside the tower, one single minute, had shifted the course of an entire company. 17 years of experience, 1 minute of docking, one clause buried deep in a contract. That was all it had taken to teach the lessons they had ignored for a decade. The Knowledge Preservation Initiative was now fully operational. Senior engineers who had been dismissed or sidelined were contributing. Historical procedures were documented. Decision-making rationales were formalized. Junior engineers had access to the accumulated wisdom of the company. Institutional memory was no longer fragile or scattered. It was codified, preserved, and actively integrated into operational processes. Sloane Carter entered my office quietly this time. Her posture was rigid but not confrontational. She had learned the hard way. The board had learned. HR had learned. "Malia," she said softly, almost hesitantly. I understand now. We underestimated you, your foresight, and the value of experience. The company, it would not have survived without your intervention." I nodded. "Understanding is step 1, change is step 2. She looked down at her hands. "We will implement the policies. Institutional knowledge will be valued. Decisions will be documented. Everyone will have access to historical context." "Good," I said, "because without it, another crisis is inevitable, and the next one might not be so forgiving." Kyle appeared behind her, tablet in hand. "The teams are ready for your final instructions. Operationally stable, documentation complete, vendors aligned, the board wants a wrap-up summary." I took a deep breath. 4 hours minimum had ended hours ago. My rate had escalated. Every moment beyond that was business. But this was not about money. Not entirely. This was about legacy, about ensuring that the lessons learned that day were not lost again. I sent final messages to the teams. "Review the procedures. Ensure all redundancies are documented. Verify all critical nodes. Check the vendor contacts. Confirm everything." I leaned back, letting the responsibility of oversight fade. They were ready. They were capable. They had learned. Sloane cleared her throat. "Are you leaving?" "Yes," I said. "My work here is done." Her eyes searched mine. "And the company?" "They are prepared," I said. "The systems, the teams, the knowledge, they are now resilient. Not just because of technology, but because of people. Remember, dashboards cannot replace memory. Algorithms cannot replace judgment. The value of experience is infinite if preserved properly." I gathered my personal belongings. The cracked coffee mug, the laptop bag, a few notes, nothing sentimental. The building had witnessed enough of my presence. My work was now embedded in systems, teams, and documents. Walking through the floor, I paused at each desk. Engineers glanced up. Some smiled faintly. Some nodded, respect without words. They understood. Sloane followed silently. She did not attempt to persuade me to stay. She knew better. Authority without understanding was useless. She had learned her lesson the hard way. The board had scheduled a final video call. Directors and executives appeared on screen, tense but attentive. I addressed them directly. "Novacor has survived a crisis not because of dashboards, not because of policies, but because of knowledge. Experience matters. Memory matters. Lessons learned must be preserved and shared. Today, the company is stronger because of foresight and preparation. Do not forget that." The call ended. The board members remained seated, digesting the weight of the message. Sloane's jaw tightened, acknowledgement in her eyes. By 9:30, I reached the lobby. The security guard glanced at my badge but did not stop me. The elevators hummed quietly, carrying me down. Every step felt like a culmination, not an ending. 17 years had led to this moment. 1 minute had sparked the cascade, but years of preparation had ensured survival. Outside, the city moved on, oblivious, but Novacor would never be the same. Systems would be monitored differently. Policies would be rewritten. Institutional memory would be respected. Experience would be valued. I stepped into the sunlight. The building behind me reflected the morning light. 1 minute had changed everything. One person had ensured that the change would leave a legacy. I walked away quietly, letting the hum of the city accompany me. 4 hours, 1 day, 17 years, enough time to teach a lesson that would endure. The lobby was quiet, the usual morning rush subdued. Security scanners beeped as employees entered, but the air felt different, heavier yet steadier, as if the building itself had absorbed the lessons of the day before. I paused at the elevator bank, watching the city light refract off the glass walls. My reflection shimmered briefly, an echo of 17 years of work, crises survived, and lessons preserved. I checked my watch. 4 hours beyond my minimum engagement had passed. My role as stabilizer and guide had concluded, but the consequences of my actions would continue to ripple through Novacor. Policies would be rewritten. Teams would operate differently. Institutional knowledge would now be valued, codified, and respected. Sloane Carter appeared behind me. She did not approach. She waited, watching, silently acknowledging the transformation she had been forced to witness. Her posture was straight, rigid, a mixture of realization and reluctant respect. "You're leaving," she said. Her voice lacked its usual confidence, replaced by an unfamiliar humility. "Yes," I replied. "The operational phase is over. The human and institutional lessons are now in place. My work here is complete," she nodded slowly. "And the company, what do we do from here?" I turned to face her. "They will survive, not because of policy alone, not because of dashboards, not because of authority, but because knowledge is now preserved. Teams know why systems are built the way they are. Lessons are documented. Decisions are contextualized. The next crisis will be handled differently. They will remember what today cost them, and that memory is far more valuable than any report or procedure manual." Kyle appeared with a final update. "The Knowledge Preservation Initiative is fully integrated. Teams have access to documentation. Vendors are synchronized. All critical systems are stable." "Good," I said. "Let them maintain it. Let them teach the next generation." Sloane shifted uneasily. "I underestimated you, underestimated experience. I see that now." Acknowledgement was enough. Words were not needed beyond this point. I gathered my few belongings: laptop, a notebook, the cracked coffee mug that had once been a gift from a team I had saved countless times. Each object represented history, memory, and the tangible proof of lessons learned. Walking through the office floor one last time, I paused at each desk. Engineers glanced up. Some offered small nods. Others returned to their work, silently absorbing the culture shift. Junior engineers, now aware of the depth of knowledge that underpinned the systems, followed documented procedures with newfound respect. The lessons had been internalized. The company had been transformed. At the elevator, I pressed the button. The doors slid open, revealing the polished floors below. The security guard acknowledged me with a nod. No questions, no interruptions. The work had been completed. On the ride down, I reflected on the sequence of events. 17 years of dedication. 1 minute of docked pay. Clause 14C, hidden for over a decade, now enforced. Umbrella archive meticulously prepared, executed perfectly. Operational chaos managed. Whistleblowers elevated the truth. HR and executives forced to confront errors. Knowledge preservation formalized. Lessons internalized. It had taken all of it: preparation, foresight, timing, understanding. One person could not have done it without the systems and people who had preserved institutional memory. But with the right leverage, knowledge could be more powerful than authority. The elevator doors opened to the lobby. I stepped out, sunlight on my face reflecting off the towering glass behind me. Cars moved along the streets. People went about their day. Life continued. But inside Novacor, a transformation had occurred that would endure. I walked away, letting the building recede behind me. 4 hours, 1 day, 17 years, a single minute that changed everything. A legacy built not on power or authority, but on foresight, knowledge, and the preservation of institutional memory. As I turned the corner onto the city street, I allowed myself a small smile. The company would remember. The lessons would persist. And the world of Novacor would be better for it. The legacy of a minute was complete.